For all those out there in the internet land that have not been with us and or are just joining, what we've been covering is a topic that was requested. It's the origin of the Bible and can we trust it today? And it's based off a book written by this gentleman here. It's called Searching for the Original Bible by Randall Price. And it covers who wrote it and why. Is it reliable? And has the text changed over time to what we have to today? And this is it's a lengthy study. I think this is what, week 5, somewhere around there. So week 5, and I think we're only into chapter 5 on this, so it is quite lengthy. Last week, and we're going to actually back up a little bit and cover some of the material that we already had as far as the primary witnesses of the Hebrew Bible. We covered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we got into some of the secondary witnesses. But Brother Gene actually had sent me a link on some new stuff that I thought I would add in. It is not in here, but I am going to read it. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, as we saw last week, I'll back up a little bit more, is a set of manuscripts that were first revealed to the world in about 1948. I think they were actually discovered between 1946 and 1947, but by the time they actually kind of disseminated that information out, it's around 1948 when it was kind of known to everybody. And they were discovered in jars or buried in 4 caves along the sides of the cliffs of the western shore of the Dead Sea in Israel. It's roughly around 223 scripts. Once you start to factor in some of the scrolls had duplicate copy or duplicate books, and so when you factor those in, it's roughly around 223 manuscripts. Based off of the analysis of some of the other stuff that was found inside those caves, coins, arrowheads, and other materials, plus carbon dating of the materials that the scripts were rolled up into and kept into, they're dated anywhere between composed between 152 BC all the way up to 68 AD. Some of the other caves around the area, most notably like the Wadi El Daili and then the Wadi Murabaat, kind of have the dates based off of those caves. Could have been anywhere from 352 BC all the way up to about 136 AD. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were the earliest known text of the Hebrew Bible. It contained the entire book of Isaiah. When you take, or in fact, on the book of Isaiah itself, when you look at it compared to the Masoretic text, there is a 95% accuracy in between the two languages. And the 5% of the variations consisted primarily of obvious slips of the pen and or spelling alterations. When you start factoring in the remaining biblical scrolls that were found in the Dead Seas, there's about a 60% of these biblical texts reflect the same text that's found in the Masoretic text. And we discover that based off these, there was an earlier version of the Masoretic language known as a Proto-Masoretic language or Proto-Masoretic text. When you start factoring in some of theirs, there's about 20% between the two that do not match up as far as the languages. Out of that 20% that does not match up, 5% of it matches up to the Septuagint, which is another witness to the Hebrew Bible, and the Samaritan Pentateuch. So there accounts for 10% of the differences. We can say that 10% that is not matching up with the Masoretic text between the old Dead Sea Scrolls matches up with either the Septuagint and or the Pentateuch or the Samaritan Pentateuch. The remaining 10% difference can be contributed to where that book was actually written. We see sections of Egyptian, Babylonian, and Palestinian books. And so when you factor those in and their language and factors of translation, we can account for that other 10%. up until I think the last one until here recently, and we're going to go over it. In 1963 through 65s, there was what was conducted at Masada. Masada is a fortress of Herod the Great. It was destroyed during the Roman siege of 73 AD. Out of that cave, we found 14 scrolls, which included fragments of biblical texts, fragments of what's known as sectarian and or like governmental documents. And those covered Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Ezekiel. Now, Gene here had sent me a text or a news article. And remember, we had discussed that God's intervention and divine intervention, some of this we learned from biblical passages that it states that some of these things may have or were kept and held secretly until a time later to be as a witness, right? So we see that happen in around 1946, 1947. We find the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, here just recently, this is an article dated March 16th of 2020. From actually, this one is I'll point out reference the one that Gene sent me was from what was that source? The Western Journal. And I actually went and looked at some of the other articles. This one is actually from the LA Times. This was written on Tuesday. Tuesday announced the discovery of dozens of new Dead Sea Scroll fragments bearing the text of the Hebrew Bible and dating back about 1900 years. These ancient fragments were found in a desert cave and believed hidden during the Jewish revolt against Rome. The fragments of the parchment bear lines of Greek text from the biblical books of Zechariah and Nahum and have been radiocarbon dated to about the 2nd century, according to the Israel Antiquities authorities. They are the first new scrolls found in archaeological excavations in the desert south of Jerusalem in over 60 years. So once again, they are still finding more pieces. This is how I'd like to equate this is my job is in law enforcement. When we show up to a situation, we gather information, puzzle pieces, right? We have to take those puzzle pieces to create the best picture of what truly happened because we weren't there. And unless there's a video, we're taking one person's word, another person's words, and we're trying to mesh it up to see what was truly happened. All these puzzle pieces that are coming in of new Dead Sea Scrolls, guess what happens? We get a clear picture, right? It's just one more quiver in our bow in our quiver as far as testament to God's word. The Dead Sea Scrolls, a collection of Jewish texts found in the desert caves in the West Bank near Qumran in the 1940s and 50s, date from 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. They included the earliest known copies of the biblical text and document outlining the beliefs of the little understood Jewish sect. The roughly 80 new pieces are believed to belong to a set of parchment fragments found in the site known as the Cave of Horror, named for the 40 human skeletons found during the excavations in the 1960s. So this was an excavation site that they had already been through once, had found these 40 remains of human skeletons and had deemed the cave and give it a nickname of the Cave of Horror. That also bears Greek rendition and the 12 minor prophets and a book in the Hebrew Bible. So they had actually found some partial Dead Sea Scrolls in that cave prior. This specific cave is located about 25 miles in a remote canyon just south of Jerusalem. The artifacts were found during an operation in Israel and the occupied West Bank conducted by the Israel Antiquities Authority to find scrolls and other artifacts to prevent possible plundering. Israel captured the West Bank in the 1967 Middle East War, and the international law prohibits the removal of cultural property from the occupied territory. These fragments are believed to have been stashed away in the cave during the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was an armed Jewish uprising against Rome between 132 through 136 AD. Coins that were struck by the rebels and arrowheads found in the other caves in the region also hail from that period of time. Here's what is of key note from these 80 new fragments that they found. We found a textual difference that has no parallel with any other manuscript, either in Hebrew or in Greek. Was quoted by a gentleman named Oren Ableman, who is a Dead Sea Scroll researcher with the Israel Antiquities Authority. He referred to slight variations in the Greek rendering of the Hebrew original compared to the Septuagint, which is a translation also of the Hebrew Bible into Greek made in Egypt around the 3rd and 2nd century BCs. In one of the other articles, what they described was one of the main fragments. It provided 11 lines of text is what they have to work with. So the point of that is what we can see is even today, it may be another 10, 15, 20, 30, 60 years. We may find more scrolls, which, as I said, is just more puzzle pieces to give us a clearer picture. We also covered last week, as a secondary witness to the Hebrew Bible, is the Septuagint. The word Septuagint is Latin for the word 70. It is the most important of the versions due to it being used by the authors of the New Testament. Most of their quotations of Old Testaments are from this source and served as an early church as its authoritative biblical text. We saw that Jewish writers such as Flavius Josephus and Philo use the Septuagint as a resource in their works. In a letter known as the Letter of Artesius, it records a highly stylized legendary account of how the Septuagint was produced. The story states it was requested, or the request was made by Ptolemy II of Egypt to the high priest Eleazar for the 6 elders of each of the 12 tribes to make a translation in Greek of the Hebrew Bible for the library in Alexandria. So we see that there was actually would have been 72 people working on this. Even though the letter claims it was translated uniformly by equally skilled translators with an accuracy that implied inerrancy, our historical facts actually showed different. And hold on one second, I'm gonna fix something here. There we go. Apologize. So we see that 72 elders, 6 elders from each tribes, and the actual Torah, the Pentateuch, was completed around 300 to 201 BC. The only church father on record that actually referenced it was Jerome. The Septuagint, in its value to us and what we need to know about it is actually a witness to a pre-Masoretic text, the Proto-Masoretic text, which actually differs from the Masoretic text. When you compare the two, they appear intrinsically more reliable, or the Masoretic text appears more intrinsically reliable than the Septuagint itself, except for when it is preferred when it is in agreement with the Hebrew manuscript, such as the biblical Dead Sea Scrolls. So when you have the two, you have the Hebrew Bible, or not the Hebrew Bible, but the Masoretic text, and you have the Septuagint, which is in a pre-Masoretic text. When you're comparing the two, they are intrinsically different because they are a different dialect, right? What they're saying is when there is a disagreement with the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, when you compare that to the old or Dead Sea Scrolls, the actual Septuagint, when it is stating the same thing as the Septuagint, that is the actual preferred and closest to it. That is where it is in agreement, is between the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scroll, is in certain certain scenarios where it does actually state the same thing. The most important out of the Septuagint we saw last week was a couple different versions, the Chester Beatty Papyri, the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, the Rylands Papyri, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Ephraim, and the Amherst collection. Now, I know probably a lot of you are looking at the word codex and going, well, what in the world is that? It's just another word for a book. Codex is the first of, when you start seeing the word codex, it is the official, the first time that manuscripts were taken instead of a scroll and put into a book form. Find, there's one thing I'm going to be going over. So everybody sees the Codex Sinaiticus. there. So God can do quite a few things, right? It's pretty amazing in what he does, how he intervenes in things, right? So here is an off, well, it ties into this, but here is an off-color interesting fact about Codex Sinaiticus. There's an interesting story connected with the discovery of the Codex Sinaiticus. It was found in May 1844 by German scholar Constantine von Tischendorf. Tischendorf had traveled to the Orthodox Greek monastery of St. Catherine at the foot of the traditional location of the Mount Sinai, which is today in Egypt. His purpose was to study ancient manuscripts. The monastery there still houses one of the greatest libraries of ancient documents in the world. As he was lodging in one of the typically square or sparse quarters at the site, where the only source of heat was a small stove, the fuel for the fire, Tischendorf discovered, to both his delight and dismay, was baskets of old scrolls. Remember the gazinias? They couldn't get rid of them, right? So they would just set them off to the side. Well, except for this time. Warming his mind rather than his body, he studied some of the manuscript leaves in the baskets, obtained more, and found they together comprise what we now call Codex Sinaiticus. Without showing too much excitement with what might spoil his plans, Tischendorf sought permission to borrow the manuscripts and take it with him to his country for further study. He says, every time I visit the monastery, I make it a point to stop by the Tischendorf letter promising to return the manuscripts, which is still prominently displayed on a wall. The Codex was first published in 1862 at the expense of the Tsar of Russia, and today is exhibited in the 2 volumes in the British Library in London. Call that divine intervention, wouldn't you? He finds these scrolls that are just sitting around, being used as fire or fuel for fire, and realizes what the treasure is that he has found. So this is where we left off last week. The Samaritan Pentateuch is also a secondary witness to the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew version of the Torah, written between the 5th and 2nd century BC. Man, I'm not going to be able to talk today. The pre-eclectic Paleo-Hebrew is a Hebrew text. By contrast, what we notice that the Samaritan alphabet, as used by Samaritans, is an immediate continuation of pre-Hebrew script without intermediate non-Israelite evolutionary stage. So basically, it's a fancier way of saying it's a different dialect or a similar dialect. There are 6,000 variants between the two, between the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text. A gentleman by the name of Bruce K. Waltick studied the manuscripts of the Samaritan Pentateuch from the 13th and 16th centuries and concluded that the text is a uniform tradition drifting away from the Masoretic text through scribal error. And although most of the errors are simply differences in spelling, in a nutshell, it is all smoothed over, modernized, and expanded text as compared with Masoretic text. So basically, the two differences is more modernized. It only consists of the Torah, which are the first 5 books through 2 Kings 17. So what we see here is, or what we're going to reference is 2 Kings 17. The reason why it is limited to the first 5 books, do we all remember why? Or do we know why? Phil kind of looks like he knows.
Books of Moses.
Books of Moses. It is limited to the first 5 books of Moses because the Samaritans were only taught the Mosaic legislation, right? 2 Kings 17:24 through 26 through 29. Let me find that and we'll read that. So 2 Kings 24 or 17, verse 24, the kings of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and from Hamath and Sepharvaim and settled them into the cities of Samaria in the places of the sons of Israel So they possessed Samaria and lived in the cities. So when we skip down to 26 through 29, it says, so they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations whom you have carried away into exile in the cities of Samaria do not know the customs of the God of the land. So he has sent lions among them, and behold, they kill them because they do not know the customs of the God of the land. And then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, take there one of the priests whom you carried away into exile, and let him go and live there, and let him teach them the customs of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they have carried away into the exile from Samaria came and lived at Bethel, and taught them how they should fear the Lord. But every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the houses of the high places which the people of Samaria had made, every nation in their cities in which they had lived. So we see the only reason the Samaritan Bible only contains the first 5 books is exactly that, is they were instructed, or the king had given instructions for a priest to come teach them the laws of the God of their land. So what is its value to the Masoretic text? The value of the Samaritan Pentateuch is not so much in its agreement with the Masoretic text or the Dead Sea Scrolls, but in its explanatory notes and glosses. Where did it go? Hold on a second. I lost my notes. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I apologize. So once again, the value is that in what it is explanatory notes and glosses, the synonyms or brief definitions written above a word or in the margin of the text that give us a more expanded form of what is found in the Masoretic text. Once sectarian tendencies, or the person that is describing this, their tendencies are factored out, these differences help textual critics better understand how the text has been transmitted over time and will aid in the restoring of the text to a state closer to the original. So we can see based off the authors or whoever's scribing this, their tendencies, so we can rule those out to better understand what it was beforehand. The Aramaic Targums. That is a translation into Aramaic by the Jews when they were in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. The pervasive influence of Babylonian Empire on the Near East raised its language from Aramaic to the level of international language. So it would be look at, let's say, if Russia theoretically took over America and invaded, and after so many years, they're being so dominant, what are we going to probably have to learn? Russian. So the Aramaic language, being of its and how dominant they were, their language raised it to an international language where it was more of a standard that a lot of people knew. The Jewish people adopted their Aramaic and used it alongside their Hebrew language in their daily discourses, and in addition, in their written books. They didn't stop also their Hebrew language, but they added in addition. The word targum actually means explanation and or commentary. So all the books of the Old Testament, except for Ezra through Nehemiah and Daniel, are in there. The most significance of the Targums are the Neophyte first, which was generated between the 3rd and 4th generation or century AD. Targum Onkelos, 2nd through 5th century AD. The Targum Jerusalem 1, 7th through 8th century AD. And the Targum on the Prophets by Jonathan ben Azul, between 270 through 330 AD. Within the Targums, it contained the Dead Sea Scrolls. Also, the most famous of the Targums was of the book of Job, written late 2nd century AD, that has a literal translation of Hebrew text similar to the Masoretic, that only deviated in a few places. The Targums, how they are useful to us, is they help our scholars understand how early texts were read and the interpretation given to them, especially in cases of difficult passages. The Syriac, I'm going to butcher this, Peshitas, or Peshitta. The Syriac Peshitta is Old Testament originated in the 1st and 2nd century AD in either the Jewish or Christian circles as a translation into Old Syriac, which is an Aramaic language from the Hebrew text. Since the 5th century AD, it has served as the official Bible along with the New Testament Peshitta for the Syriac Church. The word Peshitta is part of a phrase meaning simple or common version. All right. The Hebrew text used in the translation into Syria was similar, or the Syriac language was similar to the Masoretic text. And although it is certain the translators, because they are from different people at a different time, at a different place, they compared their work to the Septuagint. And due to its very nature of its translation and its use of paraphrasing, the Peshitta is a useful comparative text, especially when we look at the Dead Sea Scroll of Isaiah, which it has numerous similarities to. And so you kind of start seeing all the puzzle pieces and how they start to interconnect. Has anybody ever done what's known as, I think its proper term is a linear graph? Or simpler, anybody ever done a connect the dot puzzle? Here you go. Start connecting the dots. Some of our other secondary witnesses to the Hebrew Bible, one of the other ones is the witnesses to our pre-Masoretic text are quotations of Old Testament scriptures by Hellenistic Jews, such as philosopher Philo Judaeus. His quotations come from an Old Greek version close to the Septuagint, which is in some places is similar to the Hebrew text. The second group of secondary witnesses would be the Latin Vulgate, which was written in around the 4th century AD. It is a translation of both Greek and Hebrew texts by the church father Jerome that was made into Latin. And even though some of Jerome's translations were not word for word, but only sought general senses of the passage, he did study Hebrew and the Hebrew text with local rabbis. And so some of his understanding is reflected in his translations. So he didn't actually do a word to word like, let's say, the Masoretic scribes did. They were known for being word for word, not missing anything. Jerome was more of a paraphrase, more the contextual, what the idea was that was trying to be relayed. Witnesses to the original New Testament. So what are some of the witnesses that we have? The kinds of witnesses to the New Testament are the same as the Old Testament. We have manuscripts, we have versions, we also have quotations. Although the material is far, far, far more abundant. If I didn't make myself clear, it is far more abundant than our Old Testament. The most important documents for recovering the original wording of the New Testament, and there are 5,745 manuscripts to date. Just kind of like how I said with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're recently finding more. There's still a chance to find more of these. They are divided into 4 classes based off the material that they were made on or their particular writing styles. And what we see them divided into is papyri, unicles, minuscules, and lectionaries. The papyri, as it states, is a manuscript written in the 2nd to 6th century AD on paper made from papyrus plant into scrolls and written on with ink. Manuscripts written within the 4th to 10th century AD in large, eloquent capital letters that are disconnected from one another are known as the minuscules. The words were not separated and nor were they punctuated. So can you imagine trying to read that? They were written on a parchment of either sheep or goat skins, or vellum, which is a treated calfskin with ink. Minuscules. Minuscules are manuscripts written in the 9th through 16th century AD in small cursive script in which the letters are connected to one another. They're written with a running hand style. And then we have lectionaries. Lectionaries are manuscripts in which the books of the New Testaments are arranged for daily study and meditation, and not according to their chronological order. So let's look at the papyri, the Greek manuscripts. Okay, the earliest manuscripts are the ones written on papyrus, and the earliest of them is known, or was the Papyrus 52, or which is known as Papyrus 52. And it contains fragments of John 18 and is dated to around 125 AD. Okay. There's a collection of 5 papyrus manuscripts from the Oxford University that brings the total of manuscripts dating as early as the 2nd century to AD to 15. So we have 15 total manuscripts that date back to the 2nd century AD. And so that is between 101 AD all the way up to 200 AD. Several of the most important earlier manuscripts dated around 200 AD contain portions of the Gospels and the Epistles. And the most notable is the Bodmer Papyri, which is dated around 175 to 200 AD. And it contains portions of John, Acts 1 and through 3rd John, and the oldest copies of Jude and 1st and 2nd Peter. Unicles. Unicles, as we learned earlier, were produced around the 4th century AD. And this is a period which manuscripts were first bound into the form of codex, books. Okay. Codex Alexandrinus is a 5th century AD, and it contains most of the New Testament. It is only missing most of Matthew, some of John, and 2 Corinthians, but is one of the best and earliest copies that we have of Revelations. Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus contain the earliest complete copies of the New Testament. Interesting, though, is that the 2 manuscripts come from the same time period, but there are thousands of variants between them. So we see even in the same time period, the difference of variations. But where they do agree, they appear to represent a text that goes back as early as 2nd century AD. We're going to take a break here, and I'm going to read you an excerpt. Nope. Actually, that was the one from earlier, the manuscript about the Codex Sinaiticus. Now we're going to see that there are actually different versions in our Greek manuscripts. The earliest translations into various languages are our next most important source for textual criticism. Remember what textual criticism is? The process of examining the words from multiple different sources to verify what they were said and the earliest forms of that reading. With all these different translations, they are useful in cases of disputed readings in revealing what the words were in the text from which they were translated. So we can take, we'll use my wife, not to pick on her, but we have, let's say we have a Ukrainian version, let's say we have a Spanish version, and let's say, well, a Swahili version of a book. They're all translated from the same source, right? But obviously, as I think it's a movie, Lost in Translation, there are going to be words that we have in English, they don't have in Ukrainian, they don't have in Swahili, or they may not have in Spanish. They have a different word that has a similar emphasis or meaning, but it's not quite. So when you take those and you examine how the Ukrainian version was translated and how they got to their word, same with the Spanish and the Swahili, we can get back to most likely what that word was if there is a disagreement and a dispute in that wording. So the more sources we have, or the more versions, the better chance we have of finding what the actual word was being translated when there is a dispute. The most important translations of these, or versions, is the Latin, Coptic, and Syriac. And that is because they are the earliest and therefore the closest to the earliest copies of the Greek New Testament. Out of the 3, the Latin manuscripts are the most important because some of the texts they were translated from may go back all the way to the 2nd century AD, and they number more than 10,000 different manuscripts that we have to utilize. Patristic citations. Patristic citations are textual evidence drawn from citations or statements of the New Testaments in sermons, commentaries, and correspondence from the earliest church fathers. The date from these are as early as 1st century AD, so AD 180 all the way to 99 AD, through all the way through the 12th. Actually, no, it would be the 12th century AD. So between AD 1 to 1300 AD, we have all these different commentaries, sermons, and correspondence going back between early church fathers. There are over 1 million citations. So what does that mean to us? They're useful because for the most part, they're datable and provide information of their provenance, so their geographical location, which is important to understanding the textual families. So once again, let's go back to the example with the Ukrainian, Somali, or Swahili and Spanish. Based off their location, we can take and we can look at their language and identify how words were used, right? And from there, we can go back and see how it was translated. So not only because of geolocation, which is important in understanding the textual families, also church fathers wrote about disputed readings in a text and thus provide valuable information about how the variants as they existed in the text of his time. And how many times did we see that? Paul, wasn't he writing about disputes? So if we carefully evaluate these, or if carefully evaluated, since accuracy is difficult to determine because authors may be citing a text directly, which text, we don't know, or loosely from memory. So that's the one thing that we have to keep in mind, is that sometimes when we're quoting those, we don't know if they're going off their memory. What happens over time? Starts to go. Additional discoveries. So discovery of new ancient manuscripts in the new millennium. We've had over 17 New Testament papyri, which are known as the Oxyrhynchus. The Oxyrhynchus is an archaeological site about 100 miles south of Cairo, Egypt. In 2003, what is known as a Cambridge private collection also popped up. So you remember how we were talking about, I think Gene brought up a point of where are some of these items today? So we've seen museums have them, libraries have them. One of the things that was pointed out in the article I read from the LA Times was we also see the issue of tomb robbers and or cave hunters. They scavenge these caves, find all this stuff, and they'll sell them off to whomever. So there's a black market for these items, and they're high valued items. So sometimes these items end up in private hands for decades before before whoever decides to sell them off and or to give them to somebody. So this private collection, which was there were 70 manuscripts. These fragments of the manuscripts of the Gospels of Mark, Luke, and John, and the Paul's epistle to the Romans, dated back from the 4th to 8th century AD. It's again, Bedouin and our Egyptian scavengers, private collectors, and legitimate archaeologists will continue to add to our store of such materials, even though they were doing it for the wrong reason. They're doing it more for greed. At some point, we still do become knowledgeable about these findings. So now that we've seen the witnesses to both the Old and the New Testament texts, we must move on to our next couple of chapters of how to apply this knowledge and consider the histories of the composition of each testament. And by doing so, it will help us it will tell us more about how our Bible came to what it is today and help us answer questions concerning how reliable and trustworthy it may be after 2,000 years of textual transmission. I think right there is a good breaking off point. So we'll start here next week.
The scripture reading for this morning that I have chosen is John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Where John says, "And truly did Jesus many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." We're going to be talking a little bit about some things in this as we go through the lesson. But first, I just want to welcome everybody. Glad you're all here. Glad to see your smiling faces, and hopefully you'll be glad you came as well. Worshiping God in song and prayers, and taking the Lord's Supper, remembering his death. And so also looking at some scripture, I want to add another verse to our lessons about love, or our scriptures about love that I have been bringing every Sunday. In Luke chapter 6, Jesus says, "But I say unto you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you." Now, last week we looked at the woman at the well, a Samaritan woman. We talked about how there was a little bit of animosity between the Samaritans and the Jews. The Jews did not love the Samaritans, and vice versa. The Jews and the Samaritans both cursed each other. They both spitefully used each other. But Jesus is saying, don't be this way. Instead, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who spitefully use you. And that's exactly what Jesus was doing in his encounter with the woman of Samaria at the well just outside of Sychar in Syria, or not in Syria, in Samaria. And so we need to think about the woman at the well. We're continuing this story that John relates to us about this woman, the Samaritan woman that Jesus met. Remember, we started off that Jesus was compelled. He felt like he had to go to Samaria. We're not told for sure why, but I think as the story unfolds, you see pretty much why. But this woman at the well had come to draw water. He was just sitting there, hungry, tired, thirsty, and he asked her for a drink. And she says, "You're asking me for a drink? I'm a Samaritan woman. You Jews don't talk to Samaritans." And Jesus said, if you knew who it was that was talking to you, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. And so they have this bit of a discussion, and it ends up that she says, "I know Christ is coming." And Jesus says, "I who am speaking to you am he." What a great revelation that was, revealing himself as the Messiah, as the Christ, to this insignificant woman of Samaria. And yet he chose her to be the first one to reveal himself in that way, in those exact words. He says, "It is I am that I'm speaking to you." And then the story continues. At this point, his disciples came, and they marveled that he talked with a woman. Yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why are you talking to her?" Well, notice it says, at this point. At this moment in time is when the apostles, or his disciples, arrived. They had gone into Sychar to get some food for them to eat. They didn't think it was good for Jesus to go on into the city. So Jesus is just waiting there for them. They're going to bring food out. And it was that exact time that he came. What would have happened if they had come 1 minute earlier? Jesus and her talking along, and she's just starting to say, "I know that the Christ is coming." She just started saying, "I know," and then these guys come, "Hey, Jesus, how you doing? We're back with the food." what would have happened to this story? It would have just totally been gone, wouldn't it? What would have happened if they had arrived later? No telling what would have happened. They would have started talking about another conversation, and she wouldn't have done what she's going to do next. It shows us God's perfect timing about all kinds of things. In this particular case, it was exactly at the right time, first of all, that Jesus even was sitting at the well to meet this woman that came. She came exactly at the right time. They had this discussion that lasted for a bit of time. Notice I found a clock that said 12:15. Remember, we were told that it was about the 6th hour of the day, which is about noon. So after they talked for a little while, just at that same moment, the disciples came. Well, they came, and it says that, well, first of all, I just wanted to point out that that's God's providence at work. That's how God weaves all things together for our good, and that's his providence. But when they did come, they come back to the well where they had left Jesus, and there's a woman there, and Jesus is talking to her, a woman, and they marveled. That is the same word that marveled. Well, I actually put a flare in there. That marveled is the same word that's used in the Septuagint to describe when Moses approached the burning bush, how that he marveled at that. And many other times this word is used about when people saw the miracles that Jesus did, they marveled at it. Can you imagine if you saw Jesus actually lift a person that you knew to be paralyzed for his entire life, and to just pick him up and he goes off walking away, instantly healed? What would be going through your heart and your mind? Wow, that is something else. That's the same word, that's the same feeling that these disciples came and found him talking to a woman. Well, why would that be? Well, the rabbis had rules of conduct for themselves now, and all the people were beginning to look at Jesus as a rabbi. In fact, Nicodemus had approached Jesus by night and said, "Rabbi, we know that you come from God." He called him rabbi. Rabbi just means teacher, official teacher. And Jesus was these disciples' official teacher. And they knew what the rules were about rabbis. And this rule was, one of them was, let no one talk with a woman in the street, not even his own wife. That's how strict and nitpicky these Jewish folks were about their conduct. And the main reason for that was that way nobody could ever say, oh, he did something inappropriate. We're constantly having senators and movie producers and all this, people accusing them of inappropriate activity with the opposite sex. And if they never were alone, never spoke to them, nobody could ever accuse them of that, could they? So the rabbis were keeping their reputation clean. And so don't even talk to your wife, because somebody might come along thinking, who's that woman he's talking to? He's talking to a woman, not knowing that it was his wife that he was talking to. Anyway, they were very nitpicky about it. And these guys just marvel. I can't believe, Jesus, you're talking to a woman. And yet, even though they were marveling at it, it says, yet no one questioned. No one asked him, why are you talking to this woman? What does that show us? Well, that shows us the great respect that they already had for him. We don't know why he's doing this, why he's talking to this Samaritan woman, but we're not going to say anything. They might have had it in their mind, why is he doing this? But they didn't say a word. And so they were respecting him. Well, then the woman left her water pot, went her way into the city, and said to the men, come, see a man who told me all things that ever I did. Could this be the Christ? And then they went out of the city and came to him. Now, first of all, this woman left her water pot. Okay, so she left her water pot. What's the big deal? What does that mean? Well, you have to have a water pot to get water. It's not something you can just leave and go away and spend the rest of your days. She had to come back for it. The reason she left it there was she knew she was coming back. She intended to come back. And what she was doing now as she was leaving was she was going to go get these friends of hers, acquaintances of hers that lived in Sychar. And she told them, come see a man. Remember, we've been talking about Jesus as a man. It wasn't some ephemeral, glowing creature that was out by the well. It was a man. And she says, come see this man. He told me all things that I ever did. And then she says to them, could this be the Christ? Instead of trying to jam down their throats, look, you guys got to come out. This is the Christ we're talking about here. She approaches them with a more submissive attitude, saying, could this possibly be the Christ, the Messiah that was predicted to come? Could this be it? Trying to pique their curiosity. And so she's immediately left. As soon as Jesus had said to her, it is I am that's speaking to you. Well, right at that exact moment, the disciples came and she says, all right, this is my time. I got to go get my friends. I got to go get the people of the city. And she headed off to do that and began speaking a message to them that every person in that country was looking to hear one day, the Messiah has come. And she went off to give them that message. But while she was gone, it took her a while to walk into Sychar, talk to these people, and then for them to come back out. In the meantime, it says in John 4:31, his disciples urged him, saying, Rabbi, eat. Come on, we went in town, got this food for you. Let's eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat, which you do not know. Therefore, his disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him anything to eat? And Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Brian mentioned the finished work of Jesus on the cross. That was the ultimate end that Jesus, that was Jesus's food. And so we're seeing a little bit of a disconnect here between the disciples and Jesus. They're trying to get him to eat physical food, which he had to do. He was a man and he needed physical food, but he's got more important things on his mind. And he says, I have food which you do not know. Well, as it says, in the meantime, while the woman was off talking to the people, Jesus wastes no time preparing his disciples for what's soon going to happen. She's going to go talk to those people, and they're going to come back to Jesus to hear him talking. And Jesus knows this, and he's thinking to himself, he's thinking, these guys haven't a clue what's going on here. I need to get them ready to see that there are more important things than just physical food. He's preparing these guys for the time when he's not going to be around anymore. He's got 3 years to walk the face of this earth left. He's got to get these guys ready or it'll all fall flat when the church begins. And so he wastes no time doing that. But he says, there's more important food. He says, I have food to eat of which you do not know. And they say amongst themselves, has anyone brought him anything to eat? Well, Jesus is talking about one kind of food. They're talking about another kind of food. Guess what? They weren't getting it either. Jesus had talked to Nicodemus and said, you must be born again. And Nicodemus is thinking, how can that be? How can that be? Thinking physical rebirth. He tells this woman that that he can give her living water, and she's thinking, where are you going to get this water from? You don't even have anything to draw with. How are you going to get living water? She didn't get it either. Nicodemus didn't get it. His disciples weren't getting it either. When it comes to talking spiritual things, we have a devil of a time getting it. And so as we read things that Jesus says to us in the Bible, we need to remember we're people. We don't get it a lot of times. And we need to keep in mind that it's spiritual. Christianity is a spiritual thing. It's a relationship to God. And we've got to keep the carnal, the physical stuff out of it. I mean, we're physical beings. We have to live on this earth and we have to do physical things. But in our physical body, we also have a spiritual side. And that is what is important about all of Christianity, all that behavior. Jesus says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me, to finish his work. So Jesus is emphasizing the spiritual side of things, getting God's work done here upon this earth. What filled Jesus up and sustained him was living the life. And that's what will fill you up and sustain you, is living the life. What makes us feel empty and wishing there was something else to this life is because we don't live the life, and we don't let God fill us up. And so we need to keep in mind what Jesus's attitude was about living the life. He said, I am the way, I'm the truth, I am the life. Here is the life, doing the will of him who sent me, finishing his work. Well, it continues on. He says to them, do you not say there are still 4 months and then there comes a harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look in the fields, for they are already white for harvest. And he who reaps receives wages and gathers fruit for eternal life, that both he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. Now, very soon, people are going to be flocking from Sychar. They're going to be arriving there at Jacob's well, where Jesus is, to hear what this guy has to say that this woman has been raving about to her. These people will be ripe for the picking. They're excited about what she has had to tell them, and they're going out to see what it is. Those people are the harvest. They're the ones that are ready to be harvested. And Jesus is trying to get these guys to see, yeah, we have a job to do. We need to reap the harvest that God has sowed. And Jesus says, for the saying is true. One sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored and you have entered into their labors. And so Jesus says to you, you guys, your job is to reap what other people have sowed. And he says, others have labored, you have entered into their labors. Well, who are the others that he's talking about? The ministry has just begun. So who else has been doing this? Well, I'll tell you who else. Moses, 1,500 years before, had been doing it. He had said, there's going to come a prophet after me. When he comes, you listen to him. And so he began preparing the way 1,500 years before. And then the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Amos, all of those prophets had messages in their works that were messianic, pointing towards the Christ to come to redeem the world. Both Moses and the prophets were preparing the way. They were sowing the seed. And then you have the psalmist, David, and the other psalmists. There's so many psalms that have messianic things in them. Psalm 22 is describing exactly about Jesus's death. And so again, preparing the way, they were planting the seed so that when the Christ came, people would be able to receive it. And then most recently, you had John the Baptist, who came, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and saying, there's one coming after me whose shoes I am not worthy to unfasten. Get ready for him. He must increase and I must decrease. And he actually had said when he saw Jesus coming, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. He had introduced the Lamb of God to the world. And so all of these had been sowing the seed. And now it's up to the disciples to reap the harvest. Well, if the story continues, and many of the Samaritans of that city believed him, believed in Jesus, because of the word which the woman had testified, he told me all that I ever did. Now, when she said this, she's saying, last week I talked about if you went to a medium of some sort, and this medium would tell you things that happened in your life. And remember, I said, I see a man with gray hair, and you come back and say, oh, that must be Grandpa so and so, and oh yes, yeah, that's who we're talking about. And how impressed people are when this person is a charlatan and just getting information out of them and feeding it back to them and making them think that she thought of it or he thought of it. Well, this woman comes along and says, this guy told me everything I've ever done. And they believed him. They believed in him based on that testimony. So when the Samaritans had come to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed there for 2 days. Well, the woman who testified is mentioned there. I think that's really important to think about. It was a woman who testified. One of the first people to give testimony of Jesus as the Messiah was a woman. Not just a woman, but a Samaritan woman. Of all the people in that whole nation of Israel, the least of the least was a Samaritan woman. Don't blame me that they had as low of an opinion of Samaritans or of women as they did, but that's the case. And yet it was to her that Jesus gave this message first, and it was her that was the first to offer this testimony to anyone. She took it to her friends and testified about Jesus. Could this be the Messiah? He's told me all that I ever did. Now, what did we read from John that he told her? He told her, yeah, you're married, all right, or you don't have a husband. You're right in saying that, but you've had 5 husbands, and the one person that you're with now isn't even your husband. Well, how was he supposed to know that? He'd never been in Sychar before, as far as we know. She never thought he was. And so he told her stuff about her that he shouldn't have known. That impressed her a lot. But where she said, he told me all that I ever did, do you think he just, well, first thing you did was you came out of the womb and just told right down through the line specifically everything that ever happened to her? No, this is what we call hyperbole. And what hyperbole is exaggeration for effect. We have a lot of hyperboles that we use. One of is, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. That's an example of hyperbole. Now, I don't think there's a person alive that actually could eat a horse, but that's just saying, man, I am really hungry. That's what hyperbole is. And she uses this to show how impressed she was with this guy that she had met out by the well. And so when the Samaritans had come to him, at her urging, they go out to him. When they came to him, they urged him to stay with them. Jesus, come on into town. You got to stay with us. We want to hear more from what you do, what you are saying. And so he stayed there for 2 days. Isn't it interesting? At least I find it interesting that when people, normally when I've ever looked at this account of the woman at the well, you hear about they that worship him must worship it in spirit and in truth, and Jesus saying, I am he, I'm the one. And they kind of just blah, 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 gloss over the rest. He spent half an hour talking to her. He stayed there 2 days for all the other people and talking to them about who he was. And it says in verse 41, and many more believed because of his own word. Yeah, they believed because of her word, but many more believed because of his own word. They were listening to the source now, the things that he was saying, and they came to believe. What were they believing? Well, we'll see in just a second. They said to the woman, now we believe, not, and I put only in parentheses, not only because of what you said. They weren't trying to push her testimony aside, but they were saying, yeah, what you said impressed us and got us to come out there. But now we're not just believing because of what you said, but we ourselves have heard him, and we know that this is indeed the Christ, the Savior of the world. She had said, could this be? And they said, yeah, this is. So now we have the testimony of the Samaritans from Sychar. They said, we know. Not we think this could be. No, we know this is indeed the Christ. This has to be. We've heard him. We've seen what he's been doing. This is the Christ, the Savior of the world. You just can't even begin to think about what it must have been like for them to come to this realization, come to believe. The Israelites and the Samaritans, they had been looking for the Messiah to come for hundreds and hundreds of years. He's finally here. Now, she had said, could this be the Christ? As she's talking to them, and they said, this is indeed the Christ. Many more believed. Just a little while ago, I read you a passage from John chapter 20. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. John says to his readers, many other signs, therefore, did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life eternal. And so what John is giving to us is this account of the Samaritan woman and the Samaritans coming to believe in Jesus as the Christ of the Son of God. And he relates that story to us so that we too might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. I just want to throw a question out there. I'm not even going to try to answer it. I want you to think about it. And that is, did Jesus baptize these people? Did John say anything at all about them being baptized or anything like that? It's not there. What do you think? Did Jesus baptize these people or his disciples? Well, I'm just going to leave that with you as something to think about. Talk to me about it if you come up with any ideas, or if you get on Zoom tonight, talk about it then or whatever. But just think, if he did, why doesn't John say it? And if he didn't, why didn't he? Think about that. Let's bring the lesson home. Anyone can spread the news. if this woman from Samaria, Samaritan woman who'd had 5 husbands and was living with a guy that wasn't even her husband, if she can spread the news, anybody can do it. Even you can spread this message. You don't have to get to be a preacher or some great teacher or anything to spread the news. You can, the lowest of the low, wherever you place yourself on the social spectrum, doesn't matter where you are. If you're at the very bottom, you can spread the news. On the other hand, everyone needs to hear the gospel message. Everyone. This woman from Samaria, the lowest of the low, Jesus deemed her worthy to hear the message that he was the Christ, the Son of God. Everyone out there, I don't care who they are, the richest of the rich, the poorest of the poor, the most depraved of the depraved, they all deserve to hear the gospel message. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish but have everlasting life. Everyone deserves to hear it. We just sang a song before the Lord's Supper. I gave my life for thee. One of the verses goes like this: and I have brought to thee, down from my home above, salvation full and free, my pardon and my love. I bring rich gifts to thee. What hast thou brought to me? I bring rich gifts to thee. What hast thou brought to me? Jesus brought rich gifts to the people of Samaria, salvation full and free. He brings it to us as well, and he gave his life for this to happen. In a moment, we're going to sing Christ Receiveth Sinful Men. Starts off, sinners Jesus will receive. Sound this word of grace to all. Jesus will receive sinners. He received this woman of Samaria, immoral woman, living with a man that wasn't even her husband, after having 5 husbands, and a woman that the Jews wouldn't even talk to. Jesus received her and taught her his message. If you are here today and you need to receive the message, if you have sins that you need to repent of, Jesus will receive you. It doesn't matter who you are, what you've been involved in. Jesus cares about you, and he will receive you into his arms. So if you have any needs that need to be attended to, come on up and make it known while we sing this song, Christ Receiveth Sinful Men.